Hello, my name is Dr. Gerard Toal, and this is a second lecture on the book Violence as a Generative Force by Max Bergholz. And in this lecture, what I want to talk about are some of the general themes that he develops. I am not going to talk about the story. I want you to read the book and discover the story yourself by reading it. One of the values of the book, which cannot be and shouldn't be conveyed in a lecture like this, is the thick description, the detailed analysis, and it requires you to read the book in order to get that. The book is a study of a village in Bosnia, in northwest Bosnia, on the border with Croatia. And it is part of a series of studies that have been completed over the last number of years on different places in Bosnia and the violent unmaking of these. This is unusual. This particular book is unusual in that it is an historical study, so it's a reconstruction of events in September of 1941. My own book, Bosnia Remade, which I co-authored with Carl Dahlman, is a study of the violence of the 1992-95 period and the reconstruction of three different localities in Bosnia: the town of Zvornik, the town of Doboj, and the town of Jajce in central Bosnia. His work can also be situated within the context of literature that seeks to complicate the notion of the war in Bosnia being a quote-unquote ethnic war. A really good statement, an influential statement of that particular pushback against the master framing of this conflict by the international community and by a number of the actors participating in the conflict is this book here by Chip Gagnon, The Myth of Ethnic War, Serbia and Croatia in the 1990s. I would also draw your attention to a book which has come out recently by a former PhD student of mine by the name of Adis Maxis, Ethnic Mobilization, Violence and the Politics of Affect. So this deals with the Serb Democratic Party and the Bosnian War, the first 2 years of the Serbian Democratic Party. And it's a tremendous study of that political party, which helped plunge Bosnia into war in 1992. So the theme of the book by Bergholz is violence as an eventful generative force. Now, this is an argument that he doesn't invent himself. It's an argument that is found in Brubaker, and Brubaker himself is drawing upon other literature. So it is not new. What is new is, of course, how he consolidates this argument and how he develops it, and how he uses the archives in a very, very interesting way. And so he makes the argument that violence as a generative force radically shapes the limits and possibilities for human behavior. So who you think you are really does not matter. It is the context that's created by violence that's really important here. With violence being conducted, especially on an ethnic axis, in other words, violence being ethnicized. So the murder of someone is seen not simply as a criminal act, it's seen as an ethnicized act. This person was killed because they were perceived by the perpetrators as Jewish, as Serbian, as Croatian, as Muslim, and so on and so forth. That introduces ethnicity and a live or die situation based upon the identity. And so there's a rapid sorting of people into ethnic categories. That's the sort of evil genius of violence, is that it can be perpetrated by a small minority, but that small minority can so shape the political environment for the majority, the vast majority of people, by that violence, because they create ethnicity as a matter of life and death, and who whether you're part of one group or whether you're not part of another group. It consolidates ethnicity as the antagonistic social divide. So class, location, past practices, friendships, all of these things fall away. And then it also creates the desire for responsive violence, for revenge. But violence does not necessarily lead to this. It can also lead to the possibility of the consolidation of renewed ethnic solidarity based on pre-war traditions in the face of this violence. That this violence may be seen as community destructive, and therefore there's a fight on the part of a pre-war understanding of community against this which threatens, this violence which threatens community, even though that violence may be coming from certain members within the community. And so there's also logics of rescue and restraint occurring. Now, the book chronicles in great detail the kind of clash between advocates of escalation and advocates of restraint, and in certain sort of very critical moments, turning points, these two forces go against each other, and one wins and one doesn't. And if you have the failure of restraint, then you have an act, you have an event, you have violence, which then creates a new social situation. It redefines community and belonging. There's also a discussion of the microdynamics of authority and legitimate authority. In most situations, you have stable authority, and there is sort of a continuity of authority, and this is something that's built up over time. But when you have the upending of political authority by an invasion, by the displacement of an elected government by an outside invading force, and you have the rise to the fore of previously marginalized groups, then you have an upended political environment, and then often creates an upended economic order too, as you have possibilities for accumulation through dispossession, which is taking property from other people, stealing it through force. Then that leading to spiraling insecurity. So there's an economic dimension to this, but there's temporality where you have sort of continuity, then rapid break, and then the cycles that come from that rapid break and a new sort of temporal order being created. There's a discussion of why perpetrators often intensify violence after an initial act of violence, and that is the tremendous power of the fear of potential victim retaliation. And therefore that leads them to perpetrate even more violence, and of course deepening the spiral, the escalation of violence, cascading violence. And so he discusses those particular dynamics and how they unfold over space, over villages, as rumors go from one village to the next, and a previously harmonious village may be torn apart because of what has happened in a village outside, and that there's a wave of polarization created and fear created by what has happened. So there are films which deal with this. In the case of the Bosnian War in 1992, there's a film called We Are Neighbors, which is by Tonya Bringa, which is really, really excellent on these sets of dynamics and how previously harmonious communities are torn apart because of violence which comes from outside. But violence also can come from inside the community, from previously marginalized groups, as happens in this particular case study. So there's a lot of other themes in the book too, which I am going to leave to you to discover. Let me simply note, after he recounts the whole eventfulness, and this we should kind of, this is again something that comes from Brubaker's work, and Brubaker's is drawing upon some historians on eventfulness, and that is that events themselves have a particular flow-on quality and unanticipated consequences. One thing happening and then that leading to another thing, and so on and so forth. That sort of tumbling, cascading logic is part of the argument. So when he talks about eventful processes, that's what he's talking about here. He then talks about the reconstitution of Yugoslavia after the violence, in which there was not any systematic accounting for wartime violence. In fact, the accounting that did occur was often of the same nature, which was sort of execution of perceived people who were threats to the state, Ustaše, Chetniks, and others. And then you had the post-war era dominated by what he calls three mental schema. The mental schema of harmony, of brotherhood and unity, and of discord. And all of these three existing. So harmony being sort of neighborly life, neighborliness, which was something which was genuine and kind of rooted in pre-existing pre-war traditions. Brotherhood and unity being a sort of forced ideology of the League of Yugoslav Communists, the various state versions of that. And then the third one being discord, the memory of wartime violence and of ethnic discord, and particularly among Ustaše families and Chetnik families. The memory of that was still very, very powerful and conveyed at the private level, household level, to people through the 1990s. And then it, of course, you had new sets of conditions which led to the eruption of this. I want to draw your attention to a series of films which deal with this particular time. These are films that are from the region and are not necessarily films which are academic and or separate from the violence itself. They are films that are sort of politically can be nationalistic. Kusturica's, for example, his work Underground can be a critique of communism, but Kusturica now is, even though he's born in Sarajevo, is someone who is outspoken Serb nationalist and a Russophile. The movie Pretty Village, Pretty Flame is one that recounts childhood friendship, which then leads to conflict during the war. And I think it's quite complicitous with a lot of the sort of masculine-fueled, adrenaline-fueled violence in the period of the Yugoslav War, or the wars of Yugoslav succession, the 1992-1995 period in Bosnia in particular. And then I'd also want to draw your attention to Chuck Sudik's book. He was a reporter that talks about a family that's related to him and their particular story in in eastern Bosnia and around Srebrenica. And so that story is, to a certain extent, it's in a reporter's books, reporter's analysis, so it's not like Bergholz's, but it does have a story which is grounded in local community, which I think is very useful. Now, there are a number of things on Gulen Vakuf on the internet. The particular sort of Rambo repertoire that a number of fighters adopted during the takeover of Gulen Vakuf in the Bosnian War. There's a sort of a video which gives you some sense of the types of people that were going through the village at that particular time. And then this is the sort of the film Pretty Village, Pretty Flame. And one of the things that is worth noting here is that real life in often cases are imitating what people are seeing in the movies. But this is a particular culture. It's a culture of men from about 15 to 35 or so, who are sort of living out fantasies and sort of reenacting World War II. But of course, the massive destructive quality of this war is something that cannot be understated. He ends by giving us three portraits of the village: the 1991 monument unveiling, the 1992 selection of boys and men in the village, and then the post-war memory landscape, contested memory landscape there. So let's talk about some of the themes that he develops. And first of all, he has two questions that he seeks to answer. And there's a really nice summary on page 309 of the first. There's nothing mysterious here about what drove local mobilizations. In fact, the rationality at work is what stands out. There were unprecedented benefits to be obtained by joining the persecution of those now marked for exclusion according to redefined ethnic categories and their newly politicized salience. So that's the takeover by the Ustaše. Some local residents quickly perceived these opportunities and took advantage of them. This dynamic driving local mobilization into micro-level persecution on an ethnic axis, as we have noted, has broad parallels to a host of other countries, and he makes connections there. Our study thus demonstrates that high levels of persecution and violence can proceed even if a sizable disjuncture exists among actors' motivations at the macro, meso, and micro level. Widespread ideological indoctrination with the ideas of the nationalist elite, so whether people are convinced Nazis or convinced Ustaše or Chetniks, but that is not, in fact, a necessary precondition at all levels of society, nor is the existence of widespread, deeply rooted, quote-unquote, ethnic cleavages at the local level. Rather, a convergence of differing agendas and mutually beneficial incentives can be sufficient to compel a certain number of people toward persecuting and committing violence against their neighbors. So there's a conjuncture of different factors which come together. So there's no one single, simple, primordial explanation. This is a phenomena which is conjunctural and which has a scalar complexity to it. And then in the second case, how our social relations changed amidst violent events. And so he outlines a series of different points here, and then summarizes it on page 320. We can now answer the second and final question that has framed our long journey. How does violence affect identities and social relations in local multi-ethnic communities? Violence propels multiple simultaneous transformations in the meaning of ethnic categories and boundaries in profound surges, and in so doing creates new forms of community. It helps create forces that seek to restrain killing while creating new forms of power that seek to escalate killing. And violence creates new micro dynamics of nationalism that last long after the killing stops, in which incidents trigger traumatic memories that lead to momentary interruptions of what he calls sudden nationhood. Taken together, these findings suggest a single overarching argument. Local intercommunal violence is not merely destructive in a host of ways, rather it can be immensely generative force for the creation of social identities and configurations of power. And another way of putting this is that people end up living in a world made by the few who have chosen to perpetrate violence. And that's the sort of, as I pointed out, the evil genius of violence. Now, what are some potential criticism of this book? I like this book a lot, and I think it's very, very useful. I do think that there are a number of things that can be challenged. The whole language of mental templates, rather than sort of a more discursive, performative understanding of identity, I think is a criticism that could be made. There's a little discussion of the gendered nature of identity. There's one or two places where he calls out masculinity, but generally it's not a theme that is pursued with any depth of discussion. There is a discussion of affective processes. It's not very well theorized, or not theorized in depth. There is not much of a discussion of ordinary or routine affective processes. There would be some argument about the generality of the analysis, since it is a small village in the Balkans, and the degree to which that can necessarily lead to generalizations which can be applied in Rwanda and elsewhere. I think he has a good set of arguments to bring to the table, and so I think that argument is not particularly a criticism, not particularly strong one. There is throughout, you will see, and a sort of an attraction to language which can perhaps suggest or be seen certainly by insiders as an implicit exoticization and romanticism. So the ambling emerald green waters of the Una River. That is suggestive of certain affective commitments on the part of the author, which are worthy of discussion. And then the sixth criticism is that political scientists, I think some of them would be pulling their hair out, that where's the parsimony here? This thick explanation means that there's so many different factors that come together, that it's so complex that really it ends up that one cannot say too much in the way of generalization. There needs to be a less nuanced account and more parsimonious account. And as you would expect, or you may be able to anticipate, I don't have that much sympathy for partisans of parsimony in political science. I think this is a very helpful book. It is one that the thick explanation is the way to go in these particular studies. Better to have more in-depth, nuanced explanations than not. Okay, so that is that concludes the two lectures on Bergholz's book, and I hope that you enjoy reading this book and get a lot out of it. Thank you.